We're going to give a...
This meeting is being recorded.
We're recording the meeting, and we're going to give a couple of minutes for people to join, just as people are logging in and we're admitting them. Hi, Mariana. Great to see you all.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Florence.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give a couple of minutes. As always, encouraging you to say hello, write in the chat, say hello to your colleagues, introduce yourself. If you haven't been part of this meeting before, do please use the chat. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes until we have a bit more of a critical mass. It's been a while since we met, so it's great to see you all, even though we may have met in other meetings. Hi, Becky.
Hi, sorry I'm late. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. We're just saying, letting people in and welcoming. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to, yes, do introduce yourself, say hello in the chat. I think we're getting to a good quorum. I'm going to share my screen, or attempt to share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Sweetie.
Wonderful. There we go. Thank you, colleagues. So I think we will begin. Welcome, everybody, to our Global Policy and Advocacy Working Group. I'm Florence Martin, the Executive Director of Better Care Network and the co-chair of this group, or co-convener of this group, together with Becky Smith from Save the Children and Nolan Quigley from Hope and Home for Children. Welcome, Nolan, who is stepping in on behalf of Michaela, who has gone on maternity leave and has had a beautiful baby girl, I'm told. So we're thrilled for her. So today's meeting is going to be primarily a lot of updates on a number of initiatives that this group is working on, or members of these groups are working on. And our agenda is, first of all, welcome and introduction. We will then go through a number of global updates and discuss some of the follow-up to some of the main advocacy initiatives that many of us, if not all of us, have been engaged in. We will then have regional updates from colleagues on this call about advocacy initiatives in those regions. And then we will update on one of the key priorities for this group. And I was reminding myself that this is a work that began last year in November. And we started by, deciding on our work plan, and one of the goals as well was working on the follow-up to our advocacy efforts at the UN General Assembly, of course the DGD as well, with the development of this thematic brief. So we'll have some updates on what's been happening since then, including from some of the conveners of this group. And then we will discuss any other business. If you have advocacy initiative, we asked you, please do share them. There'll be opportunities for you to do that. If we run out of time, please use the chat and let us know of any other initiatives or opportunities that we may have, or development that we may have missed. So that's the agenda for our meeting today. And so with no further ado, we are going to start with the global updates. If you have any question, this is a relatively, it's a large meeting, but it's not too big. So please put them in the chat if you have any questions. And we'll have opportunity as well to put your hand up if you want to ask or speak to the question. So first of all, let's start with, I'll start with the global updates. And of course, one of the main event and main area where this community has been very engaged at Global Advocacy has been around the follow-up and the, of the Committee on the Rights of the Child's Day of General Discussion on Children's Rights and Alternative Care, which we were all very, very involved in, that took place a year ago. We've now celebrated a year since then. It's kind of astonishing to think that so long has passed. And as you saw from the messages in the task force, in the global working group, the DGD outcome document was revised, as you know, by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. It was and then adopted by the committee in June 2022. The committee made some revision to the recommendation that this group, the task force, the civil society, UNICEF task force, and the children and young people panels made to the outcome reports. Mostly I don't know if you have had an opportunity to look at the outcome document, I encourage you to do that. Mostly the recommendations have remained the same that were proposed. It's actually a strong set of recommendations. These recommendations, as mentioned on the slides, have now been included in the Committee on the Rights of the Child's report, the biannual report to the General Assembly. So it's annexed to that report. So they're now actually with the General Assembly as part of, and the committee will be briefing the General Assembly about its work, including what happened at the Day of General Discussion. So that's really important that these comprehensive recommendations are now passed on to the General Assembly in that report. As mentioned, the recommendation proposed by and large remain the same than the ones that were drafted and proposed. There have been some changes. Probably most of the changes are minor around language, aligning a little bit more with the UN language. And some of the recommendations were moved from one section to the other, so nothing very substantive. The most substantive changes, perhaps not surprisingly, were to the recommendation that the DGD Content Task Force made to the committee itself. And these were the last recommendation which were adopted, which really proposed particularly that the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, together with other treaty bodies, would provide guidance on the challenging question of the role of residential care, harmonize their guidance. This was a strong call from, I think, all of civil society that felt that the debate was very divisive, but there was a lack of clarity from the international legal bodies around the international law situation. So that actually recommendation was kind of transformed into something which really talk about the committee doing its usual provision of guidance and discussion in partnership with a whole range of actors, including other treaty bodies, but it's a much weaker language. And then the second recommendation that was equally felt to be very important by civil society was the recommendation around the development of guidance on implementation for care reforms and the establishment of quality alternative care. And that's a recommendation as well was significantly weakened. There is now no reference to the development of global guidance on this. So that's probably the biggest change. We knew that the committee was, to say the least, kind of wary of this recommendation. And one of the things that would be good to talk actually today is about, in terms of this follow-up, is what do we feel needs to happen in relation to these. So the recommendation that were adopted by the committee and the outcome document reports in English is available. We translated the full report into Spanish and French for the committee. As mentioned in the message, we wanted the committee, or at least the OHCHR Secretariat, to check on the translation in Spanish and French, just to make sure that the terminology is aligned with UN terminology. this hasn't happened yet. We haven't heard back from either the Secretariat or the committee. So right now, the Spanish and French translation of the outcome document is still an informal translation. We hope that they will come back to us because clearly many colleagues want to be able to use these documents. The recommendation itself, though, are translated in all the UN languages because they're part of the annex to the biennial report of the committee. So if you want to, look at the recommendation themselves in the different languages, they're available through the UN as part of that report, which is great. So there are formal official translation in all UN languages of the recommendation. So this is really in terms of where the process has gone. And one of the key questions for us really is around, what is the follow-up, particularly bearing in mind there's a couple of these recommendations that were directly addressed to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, as well as the CRPD and other treaty bodies have been kind of weakened. So that's something that would be good to discuss as a group. And maybe we'll take, I don't know what Becky and Nolan think, maybe we'll take this to later in the discussion as to how we do. I'm looking at Becky. Does that make sense? So we can move on to the other updates and then talk more about the DGD follow-up. Some of the colleagues who are going to be updating us on what's happening in the region will also touch upon what they're doing to follow up on the DGD process, but it might be worth doing the discussion afterwards. So I'm not sure there is, if you have questions, if you've got a hand up and I'm not seeing you, just please put your hand up. But this is where we are in terms of the DGD process. I do want to emphasize, I was rereading again the recommendation, looking at these recommendations are actually a significant advancement from where we were in terms of policy statements. Some of them are actually quite groundbreaking. And they move the international commitments on a number of fronts, including the clear prioritization and investment that must be made by states on family-based care. There's the question around justice for children and young people and adults, and the question of reparation, who have been institutionalized and entire communities that have been institutionalized and their rights violated. There's a strong language around reparation. There's also important language around the state's obligation to ensure that private funding as well as bilateral funding is directed appropriately and does not violate children's rights, and ensure that they support the institutionalization and the establishment of family-based care for children and the realization of those rights. So there's quite important language related to that. There's also very important language in relation to what states need to do in relation to regulating orphanage volunteering and tourism and trafficking, which actually go beyond what we had got in as part of the UN General Assembly resolution of 2019. So I think the recommendation themselves, with the only proviso of the recommendation to the committee, are a really fantastic basis for further advocacy. We shouldn't take them for granted. They're a major step towards strengthening the systems. So if you haven't read them, I would recommend you definitely having a look at them. But it's actually good news. Another important global update, and I'm going to ask Dragana, a colleague from Disability Rights International, who's kindly agreed to speak to this. Is the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has finalized its guideline on deinstitutionalization, including in emergencies, and published them on the 9th of September. And there'd been a range of consultation. Dragana, can I hand over to you to update us?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Florence. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see you here. Do you want me to share a PowerPoint? It was a short notice, but I managed to put something together. Apologies if it's a bit...
Definitely. No, please go ahead. I've stopped sharing and you can do that now.
So it's really prepared quickly, but I hope it will be helpful to everyone. Can you see it?
Yes.
Try to, okay. So yes, DRI was involved in the process of developing guidelines of on deinstitutionalization, including in emergencies as a support to the CRPD committee. And I will tell you a bit more how that process evolved. I just wanted shortly to for you to see who the organizations who were part of the global coalition. So these were major networks, including International Disability Alliance, Inclusion International, and other global and regional networks and human rights groups. So the whole process of developing guidelines on deinstitutionalization started when the need was identified mainly 2 years ago, when group of organizations, which are, most of them are the same as the one gathered around the global coalition, but this was called Disability Rights Monitor. And it was a quick coalition that was organized to collect testimonies from persons with disabilities and families on the impact of COVID-19. And that monitoring report was based on 3.5 months of survey, which collected over 2,000 online responses from countries all over the world. So the reason why this was emphasized, so because this COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a large number of deaths and extensive human rights violations against children and adults with disabilities in group settings, and they increased already serious dangers that were facing these populations. So during its 23rd virtual session, CRPD committee established a working group to support the institutionalization, developing guidelines on the institutionalization following this call by persons with disabilities and representative organizations. So in early 2021, public consultations were launched. So over 500 persons with disabilities and other stakeholders contributed to the 7 regional consultations. These were events that took place between January and June last year, spanning over every region of the world. And that's when the global coalition was established to expand participation, undertaking extensive outreach activities with networks of persons with disabilities in every continent. So what we also did was to ensure translations of the first draft in non-official UN languages. So a easy-to-read format was developed, as well as translation into 8 other languages. And the committee was led by 2 key principles when considering submissions. One was compliance with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the other one was giving priority to the inputs provided by persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in the spirit of Article 4.3 and General Comment number 7. So in 2022, there was a second round of public consultations when the draft text of the guidelines was published, and the guidelines were adopted, as Florence mentioned, on 9th of September this year during the session of the CRPD committee. So the guidelines provide sort of a direction, drawing on the concept of human dignity and legal grounding provided by Article 19 of the Convention, which is the right to live independently and be included in the community, And they supplement general comment number 5 to the Article 19, which further elaborates responsibilities of member states. And also it refers to the guidelines on the right to liberty and security of persons with disabilities, which is Article 14 of the Convention. And they are, because they also address the institutionalization of children and adults with disabilities. So the guidelines are intended to guide and support state parties in their efforts to realize the rights of persons with disabilities to live independently and be included in the community, and to be the basis for planning the institutionalization processes and prevention of institutionalization. So they're rooted in reparation approach, and they call for the establishment of truth commissions to investigate and promote public understanding of all forms of institutionalization and the full scope of harms caused to past and present survivors, and also to address social harms inherent in historic policies that maintain system of institutionalization of persons with disabilities. So the guidelines are unique in addressing intersectionality by considering complex and overlapping issues in a quite comprehensive manner, such as the recognition of people with disabilities facing multiple vulnerabilities related but not limited to age, gender identity, and ethnic origin. I just wanted to read one quote from paragraph 41. For example, that state parties should also tackle structural racism to prevent discrimination and institutionalization based on race and ethnic origin in conjunction with disabilities. And this was partially motivated by, you all know, the practice of institutionalization of indigenous peoples in Canada, in Australia, and the United States. We're also discovering such practices in Latin America. So this was much incorporated due to interventions of indigenous people's submissions. The guidelines are also unique in the focus on emergency situations, and that was because they were somehow motivated by the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the recent war in Ukraine served as another motivator, so to say. The guidelines also called and are building and call for improving existing standards on disability inclusive emergency response, such as EASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action which need to be further updated to reflect the right of children to live in a family. They do elaborate the right to live in the community for adults with disabilities, but are not as strong when it comes to children. So that's the area that was identified that requires further elaboration. So what's also important is that beside addressing responsibility or defining responsibilities of state parties, guidelines are also calling international actors in adhering to CRPD principles and standards in international cooperation, also in line with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I just wanted to mention, I didn't include it in the presentation, but just sort of short overview of the submissions received during the public consultations of the text, a draft text of the guidelines. There were a total of 138 submissions, and most of them, like the largest number, was received from individuals with disabilities, many of them with history of institutionalization and their family members as well, then organizations of persons with disabilities, and then civil society organization working with and for people with disabilities. So it's clear domination, so to say, of views of persons with disabilities in developing this text. The participation was also really global and coming from all parts of the world. And when I mentioned intersectionality, now to go to children with disabilities, which is a elaborate section of the guidelines. Since it was recognized that institutionalization of children with disabilities, or definition of institutionalization, is different than institutionalization when it comes to adults with disabilities. So that's why children and adolescents were given a lot of attention, and I will just go through some of the key elements of that section. The first one is recognition of the right to family life. And for the guidelines state that for children with disabilities, the institutionalization should be directed towards protection of the right to family life in accordance with their best interest, and that an institution in the context of children is any placement that is not family-based. It also, what's important, it also calls on international standards to be updated, all which justify and encourage the maintenance of residential care and are inconsistent with the convention. Furthermore, the guidelines recognize discrimination, and they confirm that state parties should ensure the right to family life for all children with disabilities. This was emphasized because we witnessed in many countries around the world that children with more complex support needs are very often excluded from childcare reform and the institutionalization process. So this part of the guidelines was addressing that particular concern. And they also state that healthy living arrangement should allow a child to establish a stable relationship with a committed adult caregiver, and that every effort should be made to avoid multiple placements of children who do not live with their family of origin. And they also address international funding in this paragraph, but I will continue because I'm conscious of the time. And you will certainly be able to read the guidelines in details. The third component, and which was really incorporated thanks to interventions by child rights organizations, was to emphasize prevention. And they state the support for children with disabilities and families as early as possible should be included in mainstream support for all children. They recognize the importance of peer support for children and adolescents that are really key for full community inclusion. They also recognize that even short-term placement outside the family can cause great suffering, trauma, and emotional and physical impairments, and that preventing the placement of children in institutions must be a priority. So for conclusion, I would like to address three additional elements of this section of the guidelines. One is that children with disabilities, or recognition of the right to be heard on matters that affect them. So children with disabilities, like all children, have the right to be heard, and their views being given due weight in accordance with their age, gender, and maturity without discrimination on the basis of disability, but also to receive age, disability appropriate, and gender sensitive support. Another element that was introduced is that children and adolescents with disabilities cannot choose to live in an institution, as institutionalization is a harmful practice. But it also recognizes that young persons with disabilities should be provided with opportunities to choose where and with whom they live, taking into consideration that independent living arrangements refer to life settings outside residential institutions of all kind. So it recognizes that adolescents may choose to live independently with support, the way it is defined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if they don't want to continue living with family of origin, foster family, and so on. And last but not least, the guidelines recognize that they say that state parties should develop and ensure access to support services in the community. You will see that there are two big chunks of the guidelines, one that talk about specialized services for children and adults with disabilities, and then the other one talks about mainstream services becoming accessible to adults with disabilities, children with disabilities, and their families. So this paragraph addresses that particular issues, and they say that support services in the community must, including personal assistance and peer support, must be available to children and adolescents with disabilities. They also call for inclusive education system, and they say that state parties should include children with disabilities in mainstream schools and prevent placement in segregated education, which undermines community inclusion and leads to increased pressure to place children in institutional settings, something that we now see boarding schools, for example, or institutions being renamed to boarding schools, which was identified in many countries around the world. So I will conclude with this. And sorry if I have taken too much time. I really encourage you all to read the guidelines carefully. I'm here if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dragana. That was very comprehensive, and it was good to be reminded about the process. Just checking whether there's anyone that have question for Dragana on the guidelines, on the process, or any comments at this stage. Not saying any. I would definitely. Oh, Becky, please.
I just had a question, Dragana. It was really interesting to see a lot of the feedback from different organizations and disability organizations, et cetera, really questioning the scope of the definition of institutionalization. And I was wondering if that was discussed when you were then when the committee was looking at the guidelines and what kinds of things they did to take that into consideration.
Yes, thank you, Becky. So there is a section 3 in the guidelines which discusses key elements of the institutionalization process, and the first several paragraphs are actually talking about institutionalization and what institutionalization is. I think the most important thing to mention is that this was entirely based on testimonies provided by people who have either history of institutionalization or are still living in institutions. And that was why the process was so unique, because there was a really active outreach to reach the most marginalized. That's why involvement of organizations was who have contact with people who live in institutions was so important. So these elements all address a really lived experience of people with disabilities, and they were included based on initial consultations, regional consultations that led to the publishment of the draft annotated outline. And they were sort of considered by the committee to be key elements to be included in the guidelines, but further elaborated. I don't know if but there is a whole section considering some of the key definitions, so to say, and terminology that is used, which I think is well worth. I know that committee had a really long discussion with regard to this particular paragraph, making sure that all elements are included, that there are no, so to say, things that are going outside of the scope of the work of the CRPD committee. So I know that they really dedicated a lot of attention to this particular section.
Thank you, Dragana. Any other question or any comments? So I definitely reinforce what Dragana said. It's definitely worth, if you haven't already taken the time to read the guidelines. The one thing clearly is this question around harmonization of views around the question, particularly the role of residential care. And there's no doubt that there's a great deal of commonality, both in terms of the CRC Day of General Discussion recommendation in relation to most aspects of care. This is one area where we're still, as a community, and the two treaty bodies in particular, are still not reaching, I would say, and Dragana, correct me if that's if what I'm saying is right, but where there's still different views as to the use of some form of residential care. And this is why I think all of us together with Disability Organization, DGD, we felt it's going to be really important to have that kind of guidance at the highest level. As you will remember, the two committees came up with a joint statement. I think it was last March. And I think many of us felt, and if you haven't seen that, it was posted at the time. So have a look at the resources in the working groups on the platform. I think many of us felt that the joint statement didn't really resolve anything. It was a kind of status quo statement. So I think one of the things that, and it's not new, we've been talking about it, but to actually for us as a community to think about how can we move forward on bringing greater understanding of this question of residential care, and particularly its implementation, because we're working with countries where there are such institutions, as we were talking about in relation to Ukraine, for example, at this stage, but also most countries. So we're still, this is still probably one of the biggest challenges in our community. There are difference of views, and it's going to be important for this working group to find ways of actually having further discussion about the implication. Dragana, please, yeah.
Just a short, thank you, Florence, just a short remark, because based on submissions received, there was somehow a misunderstanding about what the guidelines are meant or not meant to be. So the guidelines are primarily standard setting documents, so they're not policy documents. They are not giving directions to state how to implement institutionalization in great details, but rather what are the things that are not CRPD consistent and that must be taken into account when developing plans for the institutionalization. So there are quite details in that regard, but they're not giving policy recommendations. And I think that's worth noting so that people don't expect that kind of document. Because some of the submissions were addressing or remarking that particular element. So I just thought it would be good to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Lugana. That's actually helpful, I think, to clarify that. I've managed to mute myself. Thank you. Sorry. We're going to move on to the next item. Let me try to share my screen again. But that was really helpful. If I'm not seeing your chat, just put your hand up, or maybe Becky and Nolan, let me know if there's a question or comments that I'm not seeing. Are you able to see my screen again?
Yeah, yeah, we do.
Great, thank you. So before actually I go to the Ukraine group and explain why it's on the global, just as a quick update, really. The other thing as well that's come up, which we've actually only found out fairly recently, is the follow-up to the global study on deprivation of liberty, which the independent expert Manfred Novak led. You will remember it was published a couple of years ago. And as part of the global study, there was a chapter, there was an entire section on the question of children in institution and children in alternative care as children deprived of liberty. The follow-up to that global study is now being carried out by the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, Najat, is leading this work. And there is a global forum conference that is going to happen, we found out fairly recently, in November. And actually, if I can ask my colleague to put the link into the chat. I think it's the 8th and the 9th. I can't look at it because my screen is there, of November in Mali, which is talking about the follow-up to that global study and its implications. So care is a fundamental element of it, particularly children in institution. And so that just wanted to let you know of this, and we'll find out a bit more and update you, provide you with further information as we get it. So wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. That's for global updates. We wanted to also, clearly one of the big challenge and a big care-related issue that came up over the last few months was the conflict in Ukraine. And its impact as well on children and families, both in Ukraine, but also in countries that are hosting refugee children and their families. So following the onset of the conflicts, quite a few of the members of the platform, of course, were involved in the response or in supporting the response. And there was a feeling that we needed to be able to, first of all, share what's going on, what people are doing, and secondly, to coordinate better between the humanitarian actors that are working in the response and as well as the development actors. So together with some of these colleagues, we started a group which was initially really focused on that, updating each other and sharing of information, but also on identifying what are the key advocacy, key policy issues, key response issues in relation to care and aligning some of the advocacy messages. So the group was set up by members of the platform together with colleagues from the humanitarian sector initially. It met, I think at this time, 11 times. It's actually meeting on Friday again. It includes, as I mentioned, actors involved in the response in Ukraine, as well as the neighboring countries. It includes actors working at the global level, regional, and at the country level as well. The group worked, apart from sharing information, primarily on aligning joint advocacy messages, making sure that care, which is being impacted so directly, both for children, of course, that are being separated as a result of the conflict, or that are fleeing as a result of the conflict with their families, but of course the situation of children in alternative care in Ukraine, and particularly those in institution, as Ukraine had a very large number of institution and children institution. So the working group, first of all, developed joint advocacy messages, and then it worked together on producing a key consideration and recommendation document about the response in the context of the Ukraine crisis in relation to children's care. So I would encourage you, if you're not familiar and you're interested, to have a look at this document. And this document is being used for advocacy purposes by many of the members. In addition to that, the group organized a couple of learning events so far to kind of deep dive on getting to a kind of more concrete level in relation of how do we support effective response and services, and how do we address the immediate situation as well as the evolving, the longer term situation for that country and the host countries, and its impact on the care systems. So we had a learning event that was organized jointly actually with Disability Rights International that looked specifically at the situation of children with disabilities in residential care in Ukraine. And there's a number of findings and recommendations. There's a short report of that event as well that's available. That was followed on the 7th of September by a meeting that really heard from experts, both in Ukraine, but in also neighboring countries that are hosting refugees, about the situation in the foster care system in those countries. And particularly the thought there was that we really needed to understand better how the foster care system is operating, how it's responding to the current situation, what can be done to strengthen and potentially scale it up if we want to make sure that children do not just return to institutions in Ukraine. And so that was a kind of brainstorming. We heard from the experts of each of these countries and had discussion, and we're working now on a short report as well of that. The recordings are available as well if you're interested. So we just wanted to let you know this is a global group, but that's looking very specifically to the Ukraine situation and those countries. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nolan to take us to the next section with the updates from the region. Nolan, over to you.
Thank you, Florence. And what I'm going to do is actually start as far east as possible, because I'm conscious of time zones and so on. I think it's been a long time since we've met as a group, and there's a lot happening. I mean, we've been talking nearly an hour, and we've just been focusing on the global level, but obviously the action and the activity is happening across the world at regional level, country level, and subnational levels as well. So what we'll do is I'll ask first Dr. Kiran Modi from Udayan Care and BICON to give an update from the Asia region, please. Dr. Kiran.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share updates from Asia, India. I've shared earlier also about BICONs in this group. I'm happy to report that the 4th BICON, which was held on December 21, established more formally the identity of BICON as a collaborative platform for care reform in Asia. The 8 working group members of the BICON, Hope and Homes, Better Care Network, Save the Children, LUMOS, SOS, Family for Every Child, Forget Me Not, and Us, Udayan Care, and a reference group of care leavers. They were the driving force behind it. The report is available, which was shared earlier also, and it is available. If anybody is interested, they can write to us. It captures the proceedings and recommendations in great detail. I'm also happy to share that in June this year, we were able to bring together national commissions for child rights from over 9 countries in Asia virtually, and we shared the key outcomes of the 4th BICON with them. There was a lot of cross-sharing and ideas generated at this discussion. The policies, practices, and gaps of care reform, as described by the different commissioners, clearly showed the need for more such consultations. Present on the occasion as moderators were Mr. Rinchen Chofel and Mikiko Otani, both members of UNCRC. Similar roundtables with other governments in Asia are also proposed. The group is also discussing the possibility of convening the 5th BICON in September 2023, hopefully in person. And it will be a great opportunity for all of us to advance the care reform agenda in Asia. At another level, I'm also happy to share with you all that Udayan Care, along with some other global partners and care leavers networks, had organized the first Global Care Leavers Convention virtually in 2020. And after that, a strong group of care experienced persons have come together to form the Global Care Leavers Community, which meets in a cafe situation online every month. This care experience community has planned a full 10 days festival as part of the 2nd Global Care Leavers Convention coming up in November 2023. I would urge all of you who work with care leavers, if you can help us to spread the word around so that more and more youth can connect and participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Modi. I think if anybody has any questions or input now might be a good time. Okay. If not, I'm going to hand over to Stephen Usembe from Nairobi, Kenya. Stephen, could you, from Hope and Homes for Children, could you provide an update from the East Africa perspective, please?
Thank you, Nolan. Sorry, I'm still in the dark, so it's a long day of darkness where I am. A blackout, so I'm using my phone. So excuse me not turning on my video. Otherwise, you only see the teeth. So I think I'll start with Kenya. And as many of you might know, that Kenya launched the National Care Reform Strategy for Children, which is a 10-year strategy in June 8th, 2022. And to add on to that, we were able to have our Children's Act at 2022. That was in July. And those who don't know, the Children's Act is basically the basic instrument that spells out the rights of all children in Kenya. One thing that I would like to mention about the Children's Act, it's that it reinforces the national care reform strategy, in that it actually spells out that in 10 years, we should have sort of transition from institutional care to family-based care. So this is a huge, huge achievement for Kenya. At the continental level, I would like to mention that through the regional working group on children without parental care, we've pushed on with the issue of the continental study. Some of you might know about it. It's a study that looks at the situation of children without parental care in the region. The researchers were able to collect feedback from a forum that was held in Ethiopia, and the feedback provided by was provided, back to the group in Addis, the researchers. However, there are some comments that were not addressed during this process. They said these comments required additional funding or financial commitment for them to actually collect that data. And so these were not addressed. So as the way forward, the report will be tabled at the committee next session. I think it takes place in November for adoption. And during that session, it will just be adopted. There won't be more input being taken on board. So the adoption of that study will usher in another process of development of our general comment. And we hope as a working group that this will be an opportunity for us to actually influence that process. But as a way forward, we've also agreed that we need to develop sort of an accompanying paper on that study, just to make sure that we address in some of the key important concerns and very significant concerns that we have about the study. Our other sort of step would be to continue engaging the committee to enhance the knowledge of the committee members, especially on the issue of children without parental care. And I'm happy to say that we have the rapporteur for children without parental care on board. And she's accepted to be joining our meetings and listening and contributing to the discussions. The other item that I need to mention is the Kigali Declaration. This was a unanimously agreed document by all Commonwealth countries. And we are hoping it will actually lead to more opportunities for, government to government learning initiatives. To start with, Open Homes for Children is actually facilitating a learning trip by the Kenyan government to Rwanda. And we are currently working with the government of Rwanda. This trip will be taking place in 2 weeks. But the whole idea is for the government of Kenya to come learn, especially now that they have a strategy. They have expressed interest in actually looking at how they can implement the reforms, not just from the theoretical perspective, but actually seeing how it has been done. So that's one of the things that we are going to be showing them in Rwanda, but also they also come in there to see the whole aspect of DI, especially for children living with disabilities, now that some pilots have been done in Rwanda. So the other thing that may be worth mentioning is the fact that Rwanda chairs the Commonwealth. And so they'll be chairing the Commonwealth for the next 2 years. And we plan to really work with the government of Rwanda to reinforce care reform agenda within the region. We know that they're excited about this, but we are also quite more excited, because they are one of the leading countries in the region when it comes to care reform. So I think that's it from my end. Over to you, Nolan.
Thank you, Stephen, and I'm pleased that your connection stayed sound. Thank you very much. It's very busy. Any questions for Stephen before I move on to Europe? I'll just give a very brief update on an important development at the European level, and it builds on the conversation we were just having about Ukraine. You may be aware that in June the European Union officially recognized Ukraine and Moldova as candidate countries to join the European Union. This was a really good opportunity, and is a really good opportunity for anybody who wants to promote the concept of care reform at the Ukrainian level. And the reason for that is the European Commission has indicated that care reform and the deinstitutionalization should be a priority criteria for the EU accession process of Ukraine and Moldova. Specifically related to Ukraine, they recognized the high levels of institutionalization of children in the country, and particularly the issues related to the institutionalization of children and adults with disabilities. And related to Moldova, they highlighted particular concerns related to the number of babies still in institutions, and also the institutionalization again of children and adults with disabilities. So just flagging that it's an important tool for everybody who is campaigning and advocating for care reform. You may remember that the process by which Romania joined the European Union was a significant promotion of the DI process there for some years ago, 10 years ago or so. So yeah, I'll leave that there from the European side, and I'm going to hand over now to Mariana from the Latin American Caribbean side. I think there's another slide. Mariana.
Thank you, Nolan. Thank you, Florence, for putting this slide on. I will give you a brief update on the Latin American hub, and will not talk specifically on the activities we've done separately, because that would be a bit too much time. But then the Latin American hub is formed by Inter-American Institute for the Child, Downset Latin American Network of Caregivers, Lumos, Relapse, Save the Children, SOF Children Villages, and the regional LAC UNICEF office. There is a decision that this hub will meet only with a mission to discuss and clarify and develop tools to put the recommendations of the committee to the field in the region to adapt them. So as regards the last report in Spanish that we just got a couple of weeks ago, maybe two, we've decided the following activities. There will be a first seminar in November 9th to present the recommendations and work them from a regional perspective. There will be two instances for this webinar. The first one will be an invitation to the members of the committee and states. In the second one, there will be working groups with young people, care leavers, experts in civil society organizations to discuss on the most urgent priorities that we have in the region. Also, as a result of that webinar, we expect to have the regional guidelines contextualized to Latin America. And as a third initiative, we are much worried on how to make recommendations close to children in adolescents and young people. So one initiative that we're developing together with Save the Children is using the Roblox online game, that most of you may know, as a platform, as a game platform to include rights and recommendations for children and young people whenever they can use this game. So this is there's a pilot that's going to start in the next month together with a Chilean provider that Save the Children worked with before. And we think that from all the discussion, this was the most creative and proactive action that we could take. And we want to test. Actually, you know, there's a lot of discussion around technology and reaching out, technology and internet, etc., to many children and young people in poor countries. But we still believe that since it is a right, we want to contribute to that right in using this resource. That's what's going to come. And also just a quick mention to the launch, hopefully very soon, of the mapping of caregivers activism that we will run together with Better Care Network and Changing the Way We Care, that helped us identify a very good number, more than 60 activists with care experience in the region, and learning from them on what activism and participation is like and how to strengthen it. So hopefully in the next month or so, we will also launch that that report and directory. Okay, I think that's it pretty much.
Thank you, Mariana. Any other questions, or indeed any other updates from other parts of the world? I think it's clear when we have these discussions, there's so much happening, so many different initiatives that are going on. And just a reminder to use the collaborative platform to share things. So we're sharing lots of content on the side in the chat here, but let's use the facility that we have. Thank you everybody for taking your time, and particularly for those of you who had to give up late in the day. Thank you. I think I'll hand over to Becky now.
Great. So I am just going to give a brief update just about the thematic briefs to remind you, many of you were involved in these discussions anyway, but we had come up with this idea through the global collaborative platform on how do we kind of get into a bit more detail around, we all came together around the key recommendations. We recognized there was a lot of agreement. We recognize there's some disagreement, but how do we give a bit more detail, recognizing that those recommendations were really targeting UN member states at the time, but also they were very high level. And so it's difficult to take that recommendation and then apply it at the country or regional level. So how do we kind of have some thematic briefs that's not looking at, it's not a toolkit, it's not sort of too much practitioner detail, but it's really looking at policymakers on how to support systematic changes in your country. What are the legal frameworks that you should be considering? What are the systematic changes? There's a set of, so we were looking at each area within those recommendations. How do we have a series of thematic briefs that could then be used to really support care reform in different countries and regions? Can you just go to the next slide? There's a guidance on the length between 5 and 10 pages. We tend to talk too much, so it's sort of trying to be quite pointed, but at the same time recognizing there is a lot of detail on some of these topics, and they're quite broad, some of these areas. And to the purpose, like I said, was to set, you know, what are the measures and the key policies that decision makers should take to support that systematic change within their country. And so what we wanted to do is to give an update on where we're at. Some of the task groups have been running. Some of the task forces are just starting to form and to come together. But it's sort of the next step in our community going forward on care reform. Florence, do you want to?
Want me to just take over there?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you, Becky. So as mentioned by Becky, some of these task forces have actually been doing quite a bit of work. We're going to hear at least on a couple. Some of them are relatively recent. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Louise to give us a sense. The task force on foster care was the first one that got going and that has been working since, I think, it's April. The task force on family reunification and reintegration has also been meeting. I know Erica is on the call, and Erica, if you want to give a short update, please do so. We're running a little bit of time, but it'd be good to hear if you have a couple of minutes. The task force on transitioning residential care, which actually came formed through the working group, which is working on the transition from of residential care services, has also been meeting and is in the process of brainstorming on the thematic brief, and is organizing a workshop in October that is going to also inform the development of the brief, to share experiences from different actors and country contexts where transitioning has been happening. The task force on parent advocacy was also set up and has already started its work and consultation. This is a slightly different task force because it is led by parent advocates. And so it's not necessarily open to everybody. They have determined the criteria for membership. We wanted to have strong parent advocates-led recommendation. Of course, these recommendations then will be shared by to members of the working group, but we felt it was very important to provide the opportunity and the space for those parent advocates to meet and discuss and draw their learning. And so they've been meeting as well. And the conveners is led by IPAN, the International Network. We've also we've had a number of meetings, but the task force itself is still at the initial stage. A task force on transitioning from care and care leavers' participation and engagement in care reform. This task force as well is slightly different because it is led by, facilitated by, and led by, and the membership is care experienced young people and adults. The task force at the moment is about, I think, 16 members. They've just, the first couple of meetings have been really about them organizing themselves and determining how they want to organize themselves and make decisions and how they want to move the process. They've just voted for their facilitators. There's 3 facilitators. Again, this group membership is for care experienced young person and adults. And the work is really beginning in this task force. I was, listening to, Kieran speaking, and many of you as well, and of course Mariana. Some of the members are from India, from Latin America. Doncel identified a couple of experts, care experience experts, to be part of that task force. One of them is going to be facilitating it. We really encourage you, if you're working with care leavers, or you are yourself a care experience person and you want to be part of this task force, do reach out to it. Again, it's been set up on the platform. You can message them and let them know. There's also a task force on orphanage volunteering and tourism and trafficking, which brings a lot of the actors that are involved in the Rethink Orphanages group. And they've been starting to work on the drafting, on discussing the content, but also the drafting of the thematic brief. So these task forces are already ongoing, and their processes are happening. There's some task forces that are either in the process of being established or just about. Task force on public expenditure for care reform. Erica, maybe if you want to mention a couple of things on that. There's been some discussion. I know Erica is keen to get more people on it that have experience of the question of public expenditure. And we've got Alex on the call. There's a new task force on family strengthening. And this task force as well is going to be a bit different. Alex has been hired as a consultant by BCN and UNICEF to help facilitate this process and coordinate this process. And the reason we felt it was needed, we needed a slightly different process for this, is because we need to bring in experts from different sectors. It cannot just be a discussion around care and protection expert. We need to bring in the social protection, the education, the gender, etc., that are absolutely fundamental to family strengthening. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, maybe to Louise to mention a little bit, to explain a little bit what the task force on foster care has done. And then Erica and Alex, if you want, or anyone else, any of the other convener, if you want to come in briefly to give some updates, that would be great. Oh, sorry, I forgot the other slide, which is there's a number of other task forces that are at different level of discussion right now, including one on care reforms and particularly looking at the institutionalization system level change. A task force on alternative care in humanitarian context. There's also discussion of a task force on social services workforce strengthening as part of care reform. And we're also looking at a task force on the difficult subject of definitions. And clearly, as we know, this is a complex issue, but we do need to align our terminology and our understanding of the concepts. And some of that is in international instruments, some of that is not. So we're talking about how do we update our glossaries and definition to make sure that we know what we're speaking of. And then this has been going on for a while. We're all aware that as we discussed earlier, that there is still some very different point of view in relation to the role of residential care. And we've been having discussion with a number of actors to try to think about how do we create a space to move this conversation forward so we can really have that. So that discussion is ongoing. Again, if you're interested in any of these, reach out and you will be included and involved. So I'm going to hand over to Louise, if I can, just to give us a bit of a picture of what the Foster Care Task Force has been doing. Louise.
Okay, thank you. Hello. So I've been co-convening the Foster Care Task Force group with Barbara Bear from CRS. We've been meeting as a group since April this year. We've met 6 times now. The group on the platform, we have about 50 members. We've had quite a few consistent people coming to the task forces on a monthly basis. All of those people, people with a great deal of both professional and personal experience of foster care. And we've looked at various different subjects. Alongside of the task force, we decided to put on some webinars as part of bringing together some examples and some information, as well as sharing all the information that we were getting through these task force. So we have put on a series of 5 webinars on different areas of foster care practice over the last 6 months. So in the webinars, we've been looking at different areas of practice, including who are the children, identifying carers, safety. We had a webinar on parents and foster carers working together, and the most recent one on children and young people's involvement in decision making. And then we've held the task force straight after the webinar to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So that has been at both looking at the systems that and the organizational systems that people are working in, as well as going a bit further to look at what it's like in practice and implementing those systems, and then what that means for those policies, sort of coming backwards again. Currently, we've held all the groups that were planned, and we've had a lot of information during those groups and a lot of discussion, but probably not enough yet, because I think there's so much to talk about, really. But we've got so much information. So our kind of next steps now are to look at the key themes that have been coming out during these meetings, and areas that we need more information or more examples from different contexts. And that's currently where we are. And then we're going to look at what that means in terms of how we get further information, whether that's through individual conversations or more task force groups or consultation groups or surveys or different ways of doing that and getting the information. And also we want to understand more about where the groups overlap. I think that's going to be a key part, particularly the family strengthening group, the parents advocacy group, and the transition from care and care leavers participation group, for example. It's going to be important for us to see where we overlap and how we're talking about foster care within those contexts as well. So that's where we currently are. But a lot of people on this meeting here have been very supportive and very helpful and have participated in the groups, and the organisations have participated in the webinars. I'm really grateful for that support. But it's been brilliant to bring together all that information, and we have huge amounts of experience in the group and examples that I'm confident that we can bring together that information on the brief. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Louise. It's really helpful. It's been really inspiring, actually, learning from the webinars and the discussion and the experiences. Thank you for all your work on this. Erica, just to check, not to put you on the spot, to see whether you want to talk a little bit about the family reunification reintegration.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Speaker on. So I think we started work in June. This task force is being co-convened by Changing the Way We Care, Michelle Oliel from Stahili Foundation, and then Khadija Madihi from Maestral is working to help us draft the brief. We've had several meetings, including all task force meetings. I think we have 26 members now. A small group meeting to discuss sort of the critical policy issues and legal frameworks that must be in place for sustainable reintegration. We've had a meeting with a couple of care experience young people to give recommendations around reintegration. We're also having a series of presentations on country examples of family reintegration and learning coming out of those country examples. Where we need more input, I think, is from care experienced young people and caregivers with experiences in reintegration to contribute to recommendations for improving reintegration. So we'll be looking to connect with a couple of the other task forces in that regard, and working on an outline of the brief currently. Hoping in the next few weeks to have an initial draft that we can share with task force members for comment. And then maybe I'll just also take advantage to mention that the task force on public expenditures has begun with a small group of what we're calling an expert reference group. But it's been quite challenging to get people, people's busy schedules, to get people to come to meetings. And we've also had a real difficulty in identifying documented case country experiences, and so country examples. So we would love any recommendations anyone has on country case studies or examples, or people to interview for good examples around public expenditure. And very much looking for co-conveners for this task force. So please let us know if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was really helpful. And if you do know, both, as Erica said, documentation of experience around public expenditure planning, do reach out to Erica. Or if you're keen and you have expertise or you know experts, do actually provide that information. Alex, without putting you on the spot, the task force on family strengthening is just about to be launched. If you want to introduce yourself and the task force.
Sure. Thanks, Florence, and nice to meet everyone. I thought there were a lot of old friends on here, but actually it's just a few. I guess I've been out of the care community for a little while, but it's very nice to be back. By way of introduction, I recently retired from UNICEF, where I worked for 30 years, including on child protection in the early 2000s, where I was involved in the development of the guidelines, the alternative care, guidelines on alternative care, which I'm sure you all know. After that, I was UNICEF representative in Moldova, and after that, I headed the social policy group at UNICEF. So you may understand why Florence and Ani asked me to come back to work on this, and I'm very excited to do so. As Florence mentioned, the area of family strengthening really starts getting outside of alternative care alone, but it can be very much grounded in it. And to come back to the guidelines, you may remember that they start with an emphasis on preventing separation in the first place, which involves having policies which support families in their childcare giving role. That said, many of those who focus on those issues are interested in concerns well beyond prevention of separation, on economic strengthening of whole societies, on child development when it comes to early child development, for example. So there are many, many other actors that we'll want to bring into this discussion. At the same time, we want very much the care view of the issue. So we certainly hope that many of you on the call here who are interested in these topics, who are interested in the prevention side of alternative care, will join the task force. But also, many of you probably also work with actors who aren't in the care community, but who you think might have a useful voice to bring to this. Please do feel free to get directly in touch with me about them, or even suggest that they go onto the platform and join. I know the platform tends to be focused more on those who are already looking at alternative care issues. So the plan is you'll see that we have very, very recently set up that first, opening page of for the task force, and you can join on the platform. And then the plan will be to have an introductory discussion in October, bringing together those who have joined, and some others I'll try and cobble together from lists that we've been working on. And as I say, I welcome recommendations of others who might want to join. And the plan will be to get right down to it on putting together the thematic brief, getting different ideas and examples. I think one thing that's going to be very challenging is in looking at some of the big picture issues on family strengthening, looking at social protection, looking at universal services, and making a direct link to care. That's going to be challenging. So if any of you have that kind of research handy, know of work of that kind that's been done, that's going to be extremely useful for the brief. But let's wait, of course, till we have the discussion for getting into this more deeply. Let me leave it here and say I'm glad to be with you and looking forward to the work ahead.
Thank you, Alex. And we're thrilled to have you and all your experience facilitating this process. It's going to be an exciting discussion and one that we've waited for a long time. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Becky to get to our next item. We've had a lot of updates. Sorry, I see Florence as your hand up. Florence, was it about is it for other business, or is it just on?
No, it's on the task groups. I just wanted to raise one thing. I'm in two of them, transition of care and the volunteerism that are currently active. And one of the things that I found is that with the brief, which is, having about 5 different target groups, that is a big ask when you need to keep it to 5 to 10 pages. So kind of with the volunteerism, we've kind of moved away just going to policy. With the transition, we're still debating how we're going to get all of those target audiences in that scope. And the danger is that if you try to target all of those audiences who need very different messaging, that it gets diluted to a point where you're not really giving any information anymore. So I kind of just wanted to raise that point in this larger group where kind of the overarching view is being done. At a certain point, I think it might be more useful to say, okay, do 5 pages for government, do 5 pages for, international organizations or something like that, because otherwise everyone gets 2 lines and you don't say anything really.
Thank you, Florence. That's really helpful feedback. We have had one first meeting of the conveners of the different task forces. And I guess we're going to do another one. And this is definitely an issue that's going to be discussed as part of that. But there will also be discussion for this group as well to kind of feedback into this question of, how do we manage these very different audiences? And so far, we've taken a fairly flexible approach, which is the work, the task force needs to kind of think through the approach they want and so on, but we'll also bring in that discussion around aligning, and also the question of where different task forces are dealing with one issue that actually also dealt with by another task force. So we wanted to get the task force going and the work going, but I think we're getting to the stage now where we need to have, so that's really helpful to get your feedback. Thank you. We're going to run out of time, so I'm going to hand over to Becky to close us and any other business.
I just want to thank everyone for coming and being so involved. And I think it shows that we need to meet on a more regular basis so that we can actually get into more content. And as much as the updates are interesting and fascinating, I think that's the next stage. But does anyone have any other business before we close today? It's great to see everyone involved. Questions, thoughts?
Too much information. So just to say, we will be organizing a next meeting sooner rather than later. We've done once a quarter, but we recognize that doesn't leave enough time. It's the juggling, the fact that we're all too busy and in too many things at the same time. So we will be organizing the next meeting in the next couple of months. I'm looking at Nolan and Becky.
Yeah, agreed.
And we'll try to put it in people's calendars earlier so that you can, make sure that we don't double book ourselves, etc. But it is really exciting to see these briefs coming together and going forward. Anything from anyone else? Okay, great. Do connect with others. I mean, this is the whole point of the platform, is to make those connections, to reach out, to learn more about what other people are doing and working on. And I do hope we can all be in contact sooner rather than later. Great.
And encouraging you again to use the platform to post things. I mean, part of which will help us not spending all the time on updates is to make sure that you actually use this to post anything that's happening, questions, resources, etc. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.